By the end of February, every hive in eastern Tennessee sounded the same: silent. Across the valley, beekeepers lifted wooden covers and found frames untouched, honey still sealed beneath wax, and thousands of dead bees scattered across the bottoms of their boxes. Some colonies had vanished before winter. Others had survived the cold only to collapse during the first warm spell. At Mercer Apiary, 39 empty hives stood in crooked rows beneath the bare apple trees. Eli Mercer walked between them without speaking. He was 14 years old, narrow-shouldered, freckled, and barely tall enough to lift a full honey box without bracing it against his chest. His canvas jacket had belonged to his grandfather. The sleeves were too long, and smoke from the bee smoker had stained one pocket nearly black. At the edge of the property stood an enormous black walnut tree. Its trunk was split by lightning. A dark opening yawned 15 feet above the ground, and beneath it, on the snow, lay several dead bees. Eli placed one gloved hand against the bark. At first he heard only wind moving through the orchard. Then came a low vibration from somewhere inside the tree. Not loud, not strong, but alive. Behind him, Walter Briggs, the largest commercial beekeeper in the county, stood beside his truck with 2 employees. Walter had spent 47 years keeping bees. He had already told Eli that the wild colony inside the walnut would die like all the others. When the sound continued, Walter stopped smiling. Eli looked up at the dark opening. Every managed colony on the abandoned farm was dead. The colony nobody had fed, treated, moved, or protected was still alive. If you enjoy stories about forgotten farms, family secrets, and people who notice what everyone else ignores, subscribe and join us. Sometimes the thing called wild is simply the thing that remembers how to survive. 9 months earlier, the Mercer Bee Farm had been offered at a county auction for $4,200. The property included 7 acres, a collapsing honey house, an old pickup with no engine, 40 weathered hive boxes, and an orchard that had not produced a commercial crop in years. The farm had failed under 3 different owners. The first lost nearly every colony to parasitic mites. The second borrowed heavily to rebuild, only to watch a virus sweep through the replacement bees. The third bought expensive queens from several states, treated the hives repeatedly, and abandoned the property after another winter collapse. By the time Eli entered the auction room, local beekeepers called the place the White Graveyard. Eli carried his money in an old metal honey tin. He had earned it by mowing lawns, splitting firewood, selling eggs, repairing fence, and helping his grandfather with bees before the old man died. When the auctioneer asked whether Eli's mother was coming inside, Eli set the tin on the table. "I am the bidder," he said. The room became quiet for half a second. Then the laughter began. Walter Briggs leaned back in his chair and shook his head. His employees grinned. Someone asked whether the boy planned to keep bees in a school locker. Eli counted the money slowly. $4,200. Everything he had saved. The auctioneer looked toward Eli's mother, Rachel, who stood near the door in her hospital uniform. She appeared too tired to argue and too frightened to approve. No other person placed a bid. The hammer fell. At 14 years old, Eli Mercer became the owner of the most unsuccessful bee farm in the county. He had 40 empty boxes, 7 neglected acres, and less than $20 left. But he also had something the men in the room did not know about. He had his grandfather's notebooks. And in those notebooks, one sentence appeared again and again. Do not remove the bees from the walnut tree. They are teaching us something. Eli's grandfather, Samuel Mercer, had never been a wealthy beekeeper. He kept fewer than 20 colonies behind a small farmhouse, repaired his own equipment, and sold honey from a folding table at the Saturday market. Other beekeepers respected him, but many considered his methods old-fashioned. Samuel inspected slowly. He kept detailed records. He saved queens from colonies that survived difficult winters, and he refused to replace every struggling colony with imported bees. Most importantly, he watched the wild colony in the black walnut tree. According to the notebooks, bees had lived inside that tree for at least 17 years. The colony had swarmed several times, disappeared during one winter, and returned the following spring. Samuel never treated it against mites. He never fed it sugar syrup. He never opened the cavity. Instead, he collected bees that fell from the entrance, examined damaged mites through a magnifying glass, and recorded the colony's behavior. Some workers groomed one another so aggressively that they pulled parasites from their bodies. Others detected unhealthy brood beneath capped cells, opened those cells, and removed the infected young before disease could spread. Samuel had written 2 words beside those observations. They clean. After his death, Eli found the final notebook inside a wooden chest beneath the honey house floor. The last pages described a plan Samuel had never completed. He wanted to raise queens from the walnut colony and introduce their daughters into ordinary hives. Not because the wild bees were gentle or especially productive. Samuel admitted that they were defensive, small, and difficult to handle. But they survived. Eli believed that survival mattered more than appearance. His first task was making the abandoned farm usable. He repaired the honey house roof with salvaged metal. He burned rotting frames that carried disease. He scraped wax and propolis from the old hive boxes and scorched their interiors carefully. Walter visited during the second week. He watched Eli standing among the empty boxes with a pry bar and a small propane torch. "You cannot disinfect failure," Walter said. Eli continued working. Walter pointed toward the walnut tree. "If those wild bees were valuable, somebody would have taken them years ago." "My grandfather left them there," Eli replied. "Your grandfather sold honey from a roadside table." "He also kept bees when other people lost theirs." Walter's smile disappeared. He warned Eli that unmanaged bees could spread mites and disease into neighboring colonies. He suggested cutting down the tree and destroying the colony before rebuilding the apiary. Eli refused. His mother worried that Walter might be right. She reminded Eli that he had no money for replacement colonies, no commercial extractor, and no experience raising queens alone. The farm could consume years of work without returning anything. Eli did not promise success. He began with 6 used colonies purchased cheaply from an older beekeeper who was retiring. He placed them far from the walnut tree and inspected each one every week. He counted mites. He recorded brood patterns. He weighed the boxes. He watched which colonies removed damaged brood and which ignored it. Then he built several small queen-rearing boxes from scrap lumber. His plan was simple in theory. He would collect young larvae from the walnut colony, raise queens from them, and mate those queens with local drones. In practice, nearly everything went wrong. The first queen cells dried out. The second group was destroyed by worker bees. One young queen emerged with damaged wings, and never returned from her mating flight. Another disappeared during a storm. By midsummer, Eli had produced only 2 healthy queens. He introduced them into 2 ordinary colonies. One colony rejected its queen and killed her within an hour. The second accepted its queen. Eli marked the box with a small black circle. It was the only successful beginning he had. Walter drove past the property and saw the single marked hive surrounded by rows of emptiness. He did not laugh loudly. He simply told Eli that one colony was not an apiary. Eli knew that. But one colony was enough to test whether his grandfather had been right. The new queen laid dark, compact patterns of brood. Her workers were smaller than the commercial bees in Eli's other colonies. They moved quickly and reacted sharply whenever he opened the hive. They also behaved differently. When Eli placed a section of damaged brood into the colony, the workers opened the suspicious cells within hours. They pulled out sick larvae and carried them away from the hive. In the neighboring colony, many of the same damaged cells remained untouched for several days. Eli recorded everything. By late summer, the marked colony still carried mites. It was not magically free of parasites, but the mite count rose more slowly than in the untreated comparison hive. Eli made another mistake. Excited by the early results, he divided the marked colony too soon. The smaller half failed to build enough population before autumn and died during the first cold nights. Walter heard about the loss. "That is what happens when notebooks replace experience," he said. Eli did not answer. He combined the surviving bees, reduced the entrance, and left them with as much honey as possible. Autumn arrived early. Then the region's beekeepers began reporting unusual losses. Colonies that appeared healthy in September weakened suddenly. Bees emerged with deformed wings. Brood patterns broke apart. Mite levels climbed, even in operations that had treated repeatedly. Walter's company managed more than 800 colonies across several counties. His crews worked from before sunrise until dark, replacing queens, applying treatments, feeding syrup, and moving weak colonies together. The losses continued. By December, nearly 1/3 of Walter's colonies were gone. Other beekeepers reported the same pattern. A warm spell interrupted the winter, encouraging queens to begin raising brood. The colonies consumed food rapidly. Then hard cold returned. Weak hives could not keep the brood warm. Bees starved only inches from stored honey because their clusters were too small to move across the frames. Eli lost 4 of his 6 purchased colonies. The surviving commercial colony entered February with a population so small that Eli expected it to die. The hive led by the walnut queen remained stronger. It had fewer bees than the previous summer, but they covered several frames tightly. The workers removed damaged brood, even during cold breaks. Their mite count remained lower than Eli expected. Then came the week that changed the valley. Temperatures rose suddenly after a long freeze. Beekeepers opened their hives for the first major inspection of the season. Walter found silence. Entire yards of colonies had collapsed. The news spread from farm to farm. Orchard owners panicked because bloom was approaching and there would not be enough bees for pollination. Some offered to pay several times the normal rental price for surviving colonies. Eli inspected his boxes. The first was dead. The second was dead. The third contained only a handful of bees around a failed queen. The marked colony was alive. Then Eli heard the wild colony inside the walnut tree. It had survived as well. Walter arrived that afternoon. He climbed from his truck without his usual smile. 2 employees followed him, but neither spoke. He wanted to see the marked hive. Eli opened it carefully. The colony was not enormous. It had not produced a miraculous mountain of honey. But the queen was laying, the workers were bringing in early pollen, and the brood pattern was firm. Walter examined the frames for a long time. "What did you treat them with?" he asked. "Nothing since autumn," Eli said. Walter looked toward the walnut tree. For the first time, he did not call the wild bees diseased. He asked whether Eli had more queens. Eli had only 3 small daughter colonies. Walter offered to buy all of them. Eli refused, not because he wanted Walter to suffer, because selling every surviving queen to one operation would repeat the mistake that had weakened modern bees in the first place. His grandfather's notebooks warned against building thousands of colonies from one narrow line. The walnut bees survived partly because they were not identical. Eli would share them, but he would not allow one company to own them. Walter contacted the Agricultural Extension Office. Within several days, Dr. Miriam Hayes, an entomologist from the State University, arrived at Mercer Apiary with 2 graduate researchers and more equipment than Eli had ever seen. They collected adult bees, brood samples, mites, wax, and genetic material from the walnut colony and its daughters. They compared those samples with dead colonies from Walter's operation. The researchers did not announce a miracle. They found something more believable and more useful. The walnut bees carried several overlapping survival traits. They groomed parasites from adult bees more often. They detected infected brood more quickly. Their queens paused brood production during periods when mites normally multiplied rapidly. The colony also contained more genetic variation than the highly selected commercial stock used by many large operations. No single trait made the bees invincible. Together, the traits gave the colony time. Time to remove infected brood. Time to interrupt the parasite's breeding cycle. Time to survive until spring. Dr. Hayes warned Eli that daughters raised in different places might not perform exactly the same way. Mating could alter the results. Poor management could still kill them. Starvation, pesticides, weather, and new diseases remained serious threats. But the bees were valuable. The university asked permission to study them formally. A queen producer offered Eli $40,000 for exclusive rights to the line. Walter offered even more. Eli said no to both exclusive offers. Instead, with his mother's help, he created a small breeding cooperative. Local beekeepers could receive queens at a manageable price, but they had to report survival, mite counts, temperament, and honey production. No participant could claim ownership of the entire line. Eli kept breeding from several surviving families rather than choosing only the colony that produced the most honey. The first year of expansion was chaotic. Some daughter queens produced colonies that were too defensive for suburban apiaries. Several colonies still collapsed. One beekeeper ignored mite monitoring completely and blamed Eli when the hive died. Another crossed the line with gentle commercial bees and obtained strong colonies that survived well but produced less honey than expected. Eli recorded the failures as carefully as the successes. By the following winter, the cooperative had more than 100 test colonies across the region. Most still required active management, but a significantly higher portion survived compared with nearby untreated stock. Orchard owners began requesting Mercer queens because surviving bees meant more than honey. They meant pollination. Apple, peach, and blueberry growers needed colonies during a period when replacement bees were scarce and expensive. Eli began raising queens in greater numbers. He hired Thomas Reed, one of Walter's former employees, to help build mating boxes and repair equipment. His mother handled orders after her hospital shifts. The abandoned honey house became a breeding room, workshop, and packing area. The farm that had once contained 40 empty boxes now held rows of living colonies. The black walnut tree remained untouched at the edge of the orchard. Eli never cut it open. He collected only what the colony could spare. The tree was not a factory. It was the original teacher. 3 years after the county auction, Mercer Apiary no longer looked abandoned. The honey house had a new roof. The orchard bloomed again because pollination had improved. Wooden queen boxes covered long tables inside the workshop, each marked with a family line and the year it was raised. Eli sold queens, starter colonies, and breeding stock across several states. He also rented colonies to orchards and produced limited amounts of dark wildflower honey. The largest income came from licensing the breeding program to regional queen producers while requiring them to preserve genetic diversity and share survival data. The business passed $1 million in total sales before Eli finished high school. Several years later, its accumulated value and contracts reached several million. The newspapers called him the boy who saved the bees. Eli disliked the phrase. He had not saved every bee. Some colonies still died. Bad weather still ruined mating flights. Mites still adapted. Queens still failed. One pesticide incident killed an entire apiary near a peach orchard, despite the bees' natural resistance. Eli told every customer the same thing. Survival traits were not permission to stop paying attention. Walter Briggs returned to the farm during the 4th autumn. He arrived with an empty truck and removed his cap before approaching the honey house. His operation had recovered slowly, but he needed new breeding stock. This time, he did not ask to buy everything. He asked to join the cooperative. Eli walked him through the apiary. He showed Walter strong colonies and weak ones, gentle families and defensive ones, hives that produced heavy honey crops, and hives kept only because they carried rare survival traits. Walter stopped beside the original marked colony's descendants. "I laughed when you bought this place," he said. "I remember," Eli replied. "I thought your grandfather left you stories." "He left observations." Walter looked toward the black walnut. "And that tree?" That left questions. Eli sold Walter several queens under the same agreement offered to every beekeeper. Walter would record the results, breed from more than one family, and share what failed as well as what survived. There was no public apology and no triumphant speech. Only an older beekeeper loading small queen boxes into an empty truck while the boy he once mocked checked each ventilated lid. At sunset, Eli walked to the walnut tree. Bees moved through the dark opening in the trunk, returning with the final pollen of the season. The colony inside remained wild. It still produced little honey anyone could harvest. It still stung more readily than the calm, commercial bees. Yet everything on the farm had begun with its refusal to disappear. Eli placed his hand against the bark. The vibration inside was steady. The abandoned property had not been hiding gold. It had been protecting a living answer to a question the entire valley had forgotten to ask. The men had spent years searching for stronger treatments. Samuel Mercer had watched one old tree and wondered why its bees did not need them as often. Eli's fortune did not come from owning the last surviving hive. It came from understanding that survival was not something to lock away and sell to the highest bidder. It was something to study, protect, and share before the next winter made the question urgent again.